in analyzing the work of some of our favorite directors here over the years, we tried to pick some of the less obvious titles, the ones off the beaten path. And John Huston is certainly one of our favorites. Max has written extensively about him, and we've both seen pretty much all the films from A to Z. But Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, I recall seeing on NBC Saturday Night at the Movies back in the mid '60s, and it certainly stayed with me. And then I watched it again in proper CinemaScope many years later. And I think that the question for me today, the most interesting question is, here we have Huston, who in the 1940s, during his World War II service, made what are still three of the best American documentaries about, American men at war: A Report from the Aleutians, Battle of San Pietro, Let There Be Light. And so can we look at something like Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, which seems on the face of it to be a fairly overtly commercial project, but is there more here than meets the eye? And Max has a very expansive original trailer here, which may give us a clue or two if we ignore the hyperbole, and we can go from there.
Great, Gary. Great to see you. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.
What's fascinating about this original trailer from 20th Century Fox, and Heaven Knows Mr. Allison was the first of a 3-film contract Huston signed with 20th Century Fox, the other 2 films being The Barbarian and the Geisha and The Roots of Heaven, which Gary and I will talk more about. But what's fascinating about this trailer is how much of a sales tool the name John Huston is in selling Heaven Knows Mr. Allison to the public. His name is above the title, his name is in the credits, and if you listen carefully at the beginning, that is John Huston's voice we're going to be hearing.
You cannot mistake that voice.
You cannot mistake that voice for anything else or anyone else. Here's the original trailer for Heaven Knows Mr. Allison. It's 3 minutes long, which is twice as long as most trailers we see today in cinemas.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to meet 2 of the dearest, most delightful, and wonderful people it will ever be your pleasure to know. The White Sister, Angela, and her lone companion, Corporal Allison, U.S. Marines, marooned together behind enemy lines on a South Pacific island. A story about 2 different faiths which sustain and inspire each other through hardship and danger, but told in terms of laughter. Laughter that stills their fears. A tender human story about 2 people who have great need of each other.
I was drunk and you got scared of me and ran away from me in the rain.
I wasn't running from you. You wouldn't have done me any harm, I knew that. I was running from the truth.
Plan to bypass a lot of these islands on their way to Tokyo. At least that's the scuttlebutt.
Scuttle what?
Scuttlebutt, you know, the poop.
Poop?
Like guys beating their gums, giving out with the rumors.
Oh, yes, rumors, of course. Well, they don't seem to beat their gums on very hopeful poop, do they, Mr. Allison? Mr. Allison?
Yeah.
I'm going to turn myself over to the Japanese.
What kind of talk is that?
Alone, you might be able to survive, but not with me to feed, too.
Then what's the point of being a nun if we're all alone? Answer me that. Can't, can you? Because there ain't no point. We don't belong to nothing beyond this island. All we got is it and each other. Like Adam and Eve, like we was the first 2 people on earth, and this is the Garden of Eden.
From director John Huston, the man who gave you The African Queen, Treasure of Sierra Madre, Moby Dick, comes a great CinemaScope picture that will be acclaimed and cherished by all. Here is the master of great entertainment at his masterful best.
Well, the studios never undersold films back then. Is that right, Gary?
They certainly did not. And I'm wondering if that's a British trailer because I've never heard Houston's name pronounced that way before.
Houston.
Houston.
I wonder. But it does make you wonder because certainly internationally, the director's participation was a much bigger selling point. In any event, we have a director who clearly, you raised a point, Gary, about his work during World War II when he was making films for the War Department. And this clearly does tap into his war experiences and his war memories, but also they seem to be trying to recreate the chemistry of the African Queen concept.
That's right.
This chamber piece amidst the background turmoil of war.
And the two of them clearly had some chemistry on the screen. I guess they went on to make at least 3 more pictures after that, right? Including one that I'd like to see us do on the program sometime, The Sundowners by Fred Zinnemann, which deserves to be better known. I bet Dan would agree with that too.
Set in Australia, as I recall. Absolutely. And this film could not have been an easy project for Houston because, well, they let us know at the very beginning that it was made with the full cooperation, or they thanked profusely the U.S. Marine Corps. And we all know if you want any kind of military cooperation in a Hollywood movie, they have to be completely comfortable with the script and the project, and everything has to meet their approval. So not only did this movie have to meet the approval of the U.S. Marine Corps, but it would also have had to meet the approval of the Catholic Legion of Decency.
That's right.
Those are two very powerful forces that are affecting the narrative here.
And I wondered looking at that trailer, because that trailer, I mean, certainly there's nothing not in the film there, but there's almost a suggestion that carnal relations have occurred between Robert Mitchum and Deborah Kerr, which maybe maybe they didn't catch on there at the Legion of Decency, but that trailer is a little bit suggestive in ways that perhaps weren't intended by some and were by others.
Well, because it contains the money shot of Deborah Kerr's character reclined on the blanket without her habit, and you see her red hair after Mitchum had removed her habit because she was out of doors and
I was thinking of Vertigo, the scene where Jimmy Stewart rescues Kim Novak after she goes into the bay there at Fort Point or wherever that is, and then he has to completely undress her, and that's clearly happened in much more suggestive fashion than in this film. But
no, it's very true. And there was a theory or a story that went around, and this originated in the early 2000s. There was the Lee Server biography on Robert Mitchum, Baby I Don't Care, which is an entertaining read, in which they claimed that Deborah Kerr and Robert Mitchum ad-libbed a scene, quote, not included in the final print, where the two characters wildly kissed and grabbed each other. That seems to be a bit of an exaggeration. I was able to locate a book on censorship from 1964 by Murray Schumacher called The Face on the Cutting Room Floor, the story of movie and television censorship. And they mentioned Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, and Schumacher writes, the subject of the film was so ticklish that one of the movie censors, John Vizard, John Vizard, I don't know if he was with the Production Code Administration perhaps, was on location for filming of much of the movie, which would have been Trinidad and Tobago. After much discussion, it had been settled that the beautiful nun would repulse the advances of the handsome Marine. The scene had been shot, but one day, Houston told Vizard he would reshoot the scene. While Vizard stared in horror, the nun, in the reshot version, succumbed to the Marine's passion. When Houston figured the censor had spent enough time in a rage, he revealed that the camera had no film for the reshot version. So this was apparently a John Huston prank on the censor.
One of many, I'm sure, played on his sets.
Exactly.
Max, I have to interrupt. There is
Please.
an alternate version of how that incident happened, that they staged it for waiting for the Legion of Decency guy to erupt during the scene. And Houston cut and said, you just ruined a perfectly good take.
But here, Lee, this is a narrative about two people who come from very, very regimented and disciplined backgrounds, and they're trying to get on in these very difficult wartime surroundings. And you are expecting, and this is from the wisdom or whatever of hindsight, or the benefit of hindsight, we are expecting the big embrace to take place, but it really doesn't. And the tension, however, is running
Impossible under those circumstances.
Precisely. And my go-to source, Gary, I know you're tired of this already, but Britain's Monthly Film Bulletin, when they reviewed it in 1957, even the critic at the Monthly Film Bulletin was a bit squeamish, writing that the general catchpenny plot and its near blasphemous contrivance make the film an uncomfortable experience at times.
Well, so Houston Moby Dick had been a hit despite the mixed results with the color palette and so forth, and other aspects of the script. So he signs this contract with Fox, and so is this a case of, as Andrew Sarah says in the American cinema, is he simply playing it cool, cagey, and corrupt as he has been for most of his career? Sarris was not a fan in that book, at least.
Well, given some of his political alliances and political passions in the 1940s and his disillusionment with the country. We talked a little bit about this on Wednesday on my online talk for New Plaza about John Huston, his disillusionment with the country in the wake of the whole Cold War Hollywood blacklist and the House Un-American Activities Committee. Here we do have a film that seems to be endorsing the Marines and Catholicism. So perhaps Huston was playing it just a little safer, while at the same time acknowledging some of the wartime experiences he had. For me, what's very impressive is how he was able to extend a narrative with he and, of course, the screenwriter John Lee Mahan are
an excellent screenwriter. Scarface and Panic in the Streets and many other excellent scripts for 20-30 years.
Exactly. He had actually, he as you mentioned, had done a lot of writing for the so-called pre-code era. He spent a lot of time at MGM in the 1930s and 1940s. He wrote Tiger Shark for Howard Hawks, and then he'll do some uncredited work on The Wizard of Oz and George Stevens' Woman of the Year. He seems to be skewering a bit towards the right wing by this time, because he also worked on the script for Leo McCarey's My Son John, which was a very famous anti-communist.
That'll be fun to do on the program sometime.
That would be a fascinating.
We get a decent copy of it.
Absolutely, from Olive Films. But once again, Huston maybe was hedging his political cards a bit. But what's impressive that he and Mahan, of course, they're working from a novel, but they're able to tell this narrative with just these two characters over an hour and 46 plus minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite remarkable. There's no me, I love non-dialogue scenes in the first 7 3/4.
7 or 8 minutes, yes. I was clocking that today too.
Oh, you do?
Mm.
Very, very impressive. And I know Dan Cahill, when we talk about the look of the film,
and a very first-rate technical squad too. Oswald Morris, excellent British cameraman. The score by Georges Auric, who did Beauty and the Beast by Jean Cocteau, something we had on this program.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the screenplay. First-class team.
Auric, it was part of a group movement called Les Six in the 1920s Paris and French scene. They were working under the tutelage of Jean Cocteau and Eric Satie, and he is going to write some ballet scores, and then he will begin doing film work in the early 1930s, writing scores for René Clair, and he will be writing a series of Jean Cocteau films, Blood of a Poet, and then later, as you mentioned, Beauty and the Beast, but also Les Parents Terribles and Orpheus. He'll do a couple of Ealing comedies in the 50s, Wages of Fear by Clouseau, which is a very great film.
Classic.
Max Ophuls' final film, Lola Montez. He will also do John Huston's Moulin Rouge, Preminger's Bonjour Tristesse. I mean, Jack Clayton's The Innocents. It's quite an extraordinary career. And there's a style to his music Dan Cahill is also very good with film scores, and maybe he can also share some thoughts on when we hear an Henrique's score, we kind of recognize a lot of the poetry of the music.
There's no stinting on the orchestration, certainly in his scores, right?
Yet the orchestration is not bombastic. It's
Right.
not literal. It's lyrical, yet very passionate. And the fact that Houston was able to insist that they include Henrique gives testament to some of the power and influence he had at that time. You know, and Oswald Morris, the cinematographer, a lot of collaborations. Dan will tell us more about that, but they're going to work also together on The Man Who Would Be King and Reflections in a Golden Eye. They already had worked together on Moulin Rouge, did a lot of a color experimentation, which I'm sure Dan can enlighten us on. And from a narrative perspective, how would you describe, or what was your emotional reaction to how the characters were presented and how their narrative unfolded as the story?
Well, things seem to be sort of by the numbers, maybe for the first half of the picture. And then when the Japanese arrive and the stress on the characters gets more pronounced and the emotions start, coming out, then the film to me gets more interesting. That they're kind of, excuse the analogy, naked in front of each other or something. And they have to work through that. And of course, there's some Deus Ex Machina stuff happening when, we think grenades are being thrown into their cave. Actually, it's American bombs falling on the Japanese, and that completely turns things around. And Mitchum makes that heroic adventure there at the end where he disables all the guns and so forth. That's less interesting. But I guess sort of that middle of the picture when everything is up for grabs. To me, that's the most interesting aspect of it.
And I particularly loved that scene, which may have been, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes, where he is going to steal food supplies, and he's in the storage room, and he's hiding on the top shelf, and the 2 Japanese soldiers are coming in drinking sake, and they're playing that chess game, which I maybe it's shogi. They refer to it as something else, but it's a wonderful sequence where you're just observing. It's very suspenseful. And it's brilliantly done.
And this is back in the era when nobody was credited. These bit players, both the Japanese and the Marines who come ashore at the end. There's no identification of anybody.
Apparently, the Marines in the land attack were actually U.S. Marine Corps supplied Marines. According to, well, this is online, most of the Japanese soldiers were Chinese. There were several Japanese who appeared, Japanese men who appeared as soldiers who lived down in the Trinidad Tobago area. So there were at least a few Japanese, but most of them apparently were Chinese, according to one account.
Well, according to the IMDb's trivia, which if we're to believe this, there were so many local Chinese employed as extras in the film that the residents of Trinidad and Tobago were unable to either get their shirts cleaned or get takeout food during the weeks when the picture was being shot. I'm not sure I buy that, but it sounds good.
That reeks of 20th Century Fox publicity department hooey, but it could be true. Houston has a master. He's very good with the actors, and he's very good at composing his scenes. And it is very impressive that most of this was shot on location at great expense. It cost almost $3 million at the time, which is over $31 million today. And you don't see a lot of rear projection, for example, when they're in the raft or when they're pursuing the turtle, where they're in a phony raft and there's a projected movie behind them. No, they're clearly, it's all done for real. There may have been some tank scenes when they're underwater briefly, but
when the turtle is dragging him along and so forth, that was probably in the tank, and some of those interiors perhaps were on the studio lot.
Presumably,
a lot of that.
When they're in the cave. And there was one account, it may have been on Wikipedia. They were somehow, the Hollywood studios are so shrewd, they somehow managed to get this positioned as almost a British production so they could tap into the so-called is it EADY funding plans that came out after World War II to sort of beef up or promote British culture. And the Hollywood studios were all over that, just as they were all over the lottery money in the 1990s and 2000s.
Right.
Oh, let's work in a British angle so we can get access to those funds. And I believe, heaven knows, Mr. Allison was one of those. But it did quite well. It was number 13 at the box office. And
Houston went into a bit of a slump after that commercially. The Roots of Heaven, The Barbarian and the Geisha, the Unforgiven, none of those were successful, I don't think.
No, the one that followed this, The Barbarian and the Geisha. See, people always picked on Orson Welles because he was always leaving the country or going on to something else when one of his movies was being edited and others would come in to edit it. But that happened a lot with John Huston. He left, he left production or the post-production of his next film, The Barbarian and the Geisha, to go make The Roots of Heaven overseas. And so the film was recut by John Wayne under John Wayne's supervision. And Huston was very upset with the results of it. The head of the studio production, Buddy Adler, who was a co-producer on Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, apparently was seriously ill at the time. So Huston decided not to complain to the higher management. And then the third film that you've mentioned, The Roots of Heaven, that was also not successful, even though it's very interesting.
Well, I don't think after Moulin Rouge, he doesn't make a single picture in the U.S. If you tick through the ones that you just mentioned, they're all shot overseas in one way or another.
You're right.
Like Wells.
And we have to remember that he had moved to Ireland in 1952 as a part of his disillusionment with the United States in the wake of the whole quote unquote McCarthy era. And then he will become an Irish citizen in 1964. And he's doing more production in that region to try to boost film production in Ireland. But you're right. There's not a lot of US-based productions for quite some time.
Well, it's always great to see those original CinemaScope. We love watching them in the cinema. We run a couple of the films, and I'm sure Dan can dissect some of those shots for us.
And we are truly an international production today, ladies and gentlemen, because we have direct from Ealing, England. That's Ealing as in Ealing Studios. Our cinematography expert, Dan Cahill. The internet technology has been a little fickle today. We are hopeful Dan can be with us, but don't be impatient if there's a little glitch. We're going to hear what he has to say. And Dan, welcome back, and we are so eager to have you with us today.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to leap right into my slide presentation here. And I want to begin by calling all attention to the title card. I always show the titles at the beginning of my presentation. These are actually interesting, and I will return to the whole thing at the end. So stay tuned. Remember this typeface, etc. So interesting shots I'm going to begin with. I just love the composition here of this low-angle shot looking at the power of the church, a bit bedraggled with the palm trees in the foreground. This is another great bit of lighting where we have both the candlelight, which is augmented by artificial light, it would have to be in this shot, but we see the moonlight, the shadowed moonlight striking her habit. It's really quite a lovely scene. I love the way they use this footbridge. It's just adds to the composition and the diagonal line that cuts through the frame in the midst of all the horizontals. It's once again a lovely scene, obviously shot 100% on location. Here's another lovely scene where they managed to put Deborah Carr behind the thatching that she is helping to create. It's just one thing that directors and cameramen like to do. They like to break up the shot so that you don't just sit there looking at someone's face, but there's a little work you have to do to see some of it. This is the scene in the cave that we spend quite a bit of time in. And this is the scene by candlelight. And soon they extinguish the candle. And look how much light is still in the cave. No cave has this kind of light. But audiences are forgiving. They know that it's supposed to look dim and not totally black as it would have been in real life. Another powerful shot is the burning of the church. And I caught this before the steeple actually collapses, but it's a powerful image and it's used very effectively in the film. Another powerful image is the intimidating sight of the Japanese troop ship coming around the point on the island. It is a surprising moment in the film, and it's shot very well, as is the sequence where the Japanese boats are landing on the beach, as we see here. This is a really scary shot. Clearly shot day for night. They're using filters. This is not a night shot, but Oswald Morris really makes it look effective by the brightness of the light shining from the Japanese patrol boat that's looking along the shoreline. This shot is masterful, how you can have Robert Mitchum so dark that you really have a hard time knowing it's him, but his eyes are glowing. I don't know exactly how he did that. This is very hard to do. I doubt that there were post-production special effects as there would have been today, but my hat is off to Mr. Morris for making this look so natural and effective. This is a suspenseful sequence, and we want to see only his eyes. Once again, another beautiful shot of Deborah Kerr with the crucifix that's all important to her life, contrasted against the white of her habit. This is a brilliant thing where Mitchum's character, Mr. Allison, decides to please her, give her something out of the usual, and brings a red flower into the cave. And the way it's used in this shot, in the scene, is striking. There isn't a lot of red in this film, especially in the cave scene. There is no really vivid color at all, and they use it dramatically to indicate a social gesture from him to her. Another dramatic shot of the war being viewed from miles away. They see the lighting effects on the horizon. This could easily have been a special effects shot. I doubt if they were actually blowing things up on the horizon, but it looks very real and very effective to me. The dance business, don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me, adds a moment of liveliness and good humor in the film, and it's desperately needed. Now, this scene is after Sister Angela is frightened by Mr. Allison, and she runs off and lies down in the dirt and the mud in the jungle. There's been a lot of rain. It's a very damp area. And in the stories about the film, people pay great tribute to Deborah Kerr for being very willing to wallow around in the mud for what must have been multiple takes on this, never complaining. And she was obviously viewed with great respect and admiration by the cast and crew. Now, this is the scene that Gary and Max referenced. And indeed, one can't help but think of Vertigo, which came out a year or more after this film. I don't know that it's possible to say that this film influenced the other, but it did come out beforehand, and you can't help but make a connection in your head between a protagonist who is stripping the leading lady, off camera, of course, with a good purpose, not just lust. Now, this shot of the bombs exploding is actually a mistake. The bombs here were supposed to go off in sequence, seriatim, but something went wrong and they all exploded all at once. Not supposed to happen. They kept it in the film because it's so dramatic. But Oswald Morris, the aforementioned cinematographer, in his memoir entitled Houston, We Have a Problem, he says that he never really trusted the explosives expert as soon as he met him, because the man had lost an eye and was missing several fingers on both hands. That's not a good way to recommend an explosives expert, if you ask me. This is a little hard to see, but in the foreground, we see Mitchum's legs doing a little, today we would call it a happy dance at what's happening in the battle down below them. This could be seen as a tribute to John Huston's father, Walter Huston, who danced a similar sort of jig in The Treasure of Sierra Madre, I think they struck gold at some point, and he was just dancing with joy. And Mitchum tried, not all that successfully, to pay homage to that. This scene, to me, is the emotional center point of the film, and it really touches me. This is where they know they're going to be parting company, and they each talk about what knowing the other person has meant to them. And Mitchum has said his piece, and she has said her piece, and he is so moved that he has to look away from her for fear he will break down in tears. And heaven knows, Mr. Allison, no Marine is ever allowed to cry, especially in a movie. This is from the very last scene of the film, and I just love the fact that she is helping him to smoke. I'm not sure I've ever seen a scene quite like this in a movie, but it's very touching. And it says that their friendship may continue well beyond their departure from the island. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago the opening titles. I have never in a movie seen this happen, where the title is imposed over the final shot of the film, but in a different font. This is in script, and the previous image, which I will display right now, was in rather heavy block letters. I don't know what they were saying. Clearly a shift in mood. The mood is warmer now between the two of them, but it's a very interesting situation that I found interesting and intriguing. There may be a story behind it. I honestly don't know. But back to you guys.
Thank you, Dan, for that typically outstanding visual overview.
That was beautifully done. Gentlemen, I have to take a brief break here because we're changing shows at the cinema, but I will return.
Okay. It's funny, when I saw that title at the end, Dan, it is unusual because it doesn't do the usual "the end" as we often see at that time.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I presume we, the audience, are supposed to take away, well, heaven knows, Mr. Allison, we don't know where this is going to lead with the two of you. That's the bad boy in me, perhaps. But
well, I think that's okay, because their friendship is clearly not based on lust, i.e. sexual attraction, but it's based on the common experiences they've had and how each of them has been able to sort of fill in an empty sector in the other's life. Each of them has been sort of a limited character without a full experience of life. Mitchum has never known a family or a spouse, certainly. And heaven knows what Sister Angela has known about men in her life. We never learn much about that, but we can assume there haven't been many. And they've each sort of filled in that empty quadrant in each other's life. And I found that extremely moving and the basis for an ongoing relationship, friendship, cordiality, whatever you want to think of it.
it would be so interesting to consider how the movie might have changed had Huston made it, oh, I don't know, 5-6 years later, because we touched upon this the other day. His other films with religious themes, not counting the Bible, none of us talk about that who are Huston fans.
Thank you for that.
They tend to be rather cynical when we think of Night of the Iguana and Richard Burton's religious figure having a meltdown in church, and Wise Blood, a very twisted dark comedy satirizing religious cultism and so forth. It would have been fascinating how Huston's take might have been, say, in the 1960s.
Indeed, with a more liberal atmosphere in Hollywood and the culture at large, it might have been a little different. But I still think the 60s was too early to start challenging the Legion of Decency and those people who were still operating. It might have had to spill into the 70s before they could really take a chance with it. But one interesting tale is that, as I read it, it was filmed on the island of Tobago. Apparently, Trinidad was out of the picture, although it's often lumped in as the name of the country. And Mitchum's previous film, called Fire Down Below, had been filmed in Tobago. And Mitchum hated fire down below. It was a miserable experience. So when the offer came in to work with John Huston in Tobago, he started balking, and he really didn't want to go back to this place where he'd been so miserable. He finally agreed to it. And when he arrived, they started shooting in sequence, and they began with the scenes of him alone in the raft. Now we have two famous, very smart, very swaggering macho men in Robert Mitchum and John Huston. And Mitchum started complaining. He was not happy to be there. And Huston used his authority to sort of, shall we say, punish or torment Mitchum by making him stay in that raft and do multiple takes. And eventually, I think you might say that he broke Mitchum down, but I think they came to an understanding that A, Huston was the boss, and B, the only way they could do anything was if they got along. And they apparently had a really strong friendship by the time the film ended. But it was not without its Rocky's approach on the beginning.
Because Mitchum does give a wonderful performance in that movie.
He does.
Very
And
sedate.
I will confess that Mitchum is one of my very favorite actors. It's taken me my lifetime until about 15 years ago when Lee Server's biography came out, and I started reading it and realizing, boy, there's a lot of depth here. And you kind of have to go beyond just the film and read some of the stories about what an interesting guy Mitchum was. He was self-taught, never really had much schooling, and yet he was always prepared, knew his lines every morning, even though he might have been drinking all night with his buddies on the crew and brawling in a bar. He was that kind of guy, but he could be a reserved, polite, very knowledgeable gentleman with most people. And I really kind of wish I'd known him in real life. I think he would have been a fun guy to be with. Very entertaining.
I was getting in the Mitchum territory late in his career when I was a secretary at ABC Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. And one of the big productions at the time was the miniseries The Winds of War, based on the Herman Wouk novel, which of course starred Robert Mitchum as Pug Henry. And I was hearing stories, when Mitchum was on the road promoting that. But he was still incredibly active. He had been a bit of a drifter and a teen vagrant. His character in this film kind of sounds very Mitchum-like when you look at Mitchum's own background.
Yeah, I was just going to say we not too long ago discussed him in Blood on the Moon in one of our talkbacks. And I suspect we will be coming back to Robert Mitchum movies in the future. I don't think this is our
How
last.
can you not?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No. And I was just going to say, Deborah Kerr came from Scotland, and she had actually started off as a dancer in the Sadler's Wells Ballet School. She performed on stage in London, but soon turned to acting. Her film debut was in 1941 for Major Barbara, the film, which co-starred Rex Harrison. And then we're going to see her in a couple of Powell Pressburger films. We're talking about Powell and Pressburger again in late November, but she's going to appear in 3 roles in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, and she will play one of the nuns. There's a nun character again in Powell and Pressburger's Black Narcissus, before MGM imports her to Hollywood, if she'll be in Quo Vadis and other films, and becomes a major staple throughout the 1950s, playing very elegant, classy, repressed, respectable women who have undercurrents of sensuality, desperate to get out. And From Here to Eternity is one such famous example. We're going to get a little zany in October, the month of Halloween, because we're going to have as our next talk back in 2 weeks, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948, considered one of their finest comedy collaborations, which featured many of the Universal Pictures monsters, including Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula. So that's going to be on October 8th. 4 days before that, I will be giving a lecture online on the history of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Of course, we're going to emphasize the motion pictures made from that novel.
One more shameless advertisement for myself, that on October 18th, I will be delivering my second lecture for New Plaza on sci-fi and horror films of the 1950s. So any of you who have any recollections of those films will want to tune in for that, I'm sure.
NewPlazaCinema.org has all the information on our upcoming programs. I'm looking in the chat section here, and Russell wrote, I read that the scene in the storage room, which Gary and I were discussing, when the rat appeared, perhaps had an influence on George Lucas in filming the Indiana Jones film, presumably Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was masterful. Well, that is just a terrific scene. Very Hitchcockian, very visual, and very modern. I mean, it isn't done in a very exaggerated way. It's done in a very realistic and very suspenseful way.
And it's excruciating to watch.
Yes.
I mean, just watching an active, energetic actor like Robert Mitchum forced to remain silent for quite some time, hours on end, not in the movie, but in real life, it would have taken that long. So that's a brilliant scene.
And it reminds me, when I spoke about Huston on Wednesday, Huston had a tendency to introduce some very modernistic and very cool element to what could have been a traditional wartime setting. In this case, not a lot of other directors making a Pacific World War II thriller or action picture would have thought of a scene like this, which to me comes out of a suspense picture. In the movie he made during World War II, Across the Pacific, which is seen as more of a pedestrian effort to boost the morale of the war or during the war, there is a great scene with Humphrey Bogart in a Japanese cinema where he is secretly meeting a Japanese agent of some kind or an associate, and they're watching a film, and there's you hear the voice of a benshi, somebody who is describing the action in the movie while it's being projected silently, which is how movies were shown in Japan and other Asian countries. Very sophisticated, very intelligent for a Hollywood director to put in a film at that time. I'm going to start taking some questions. I see Joshua has his hand up. Joshua, I'm going to ask you to start your video and unmute yourself. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Heaven Knows Mr. Allison.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Joshua.
Okay. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dan on being one of the few people I know who pronounces Tobago correctly. Friends of mine who live there say that there is a big difference between what goes on in Tobago and what goes on in Trinidad. Trinidad is where the fun is. Secondly, I wish you would date the film for me in terms of when it came out as opposed to The King and I, when she was in that, and also The Winds of War was something that, a series that I found fascinating too. When was it?
So King and I was a year before. That was 1956 with Deborah Carr. And The Winds of War was aired over several evenings in 1983. And I remember at the time, although we can argue whether the Nielsen ratings were accurate or not, ABC was reporting a combined audience for the Winds of War miniseries with Robert Mitchum at 140 million. So when today's streaming services are bragging about getting 10 million people to watch one of their productions, I'm shaking my head, because the Winds of War with Robert Mitchum got 10 times that number. But that's 1983, so that's far in the future. Well, thank you, Joshua. We'll be seeing you soon.
Thank you. Good to see you, Joshua.
And Russell, I don't know, your video is on. Perhaps you have a thought you'd like to share with us.
But you, oh, good.
Yes, good afternoon. A wonderful discussion. I had two comments and a question. The one comment is I think that Deborah Kerr, did she win an Academy Award for this? And I think it was, I read that there was also an Academy Award nomination for the screenplay.
There were Academy Award nominations for the screenplay, and I believe she may have been nominated, but in 57, she didn't get it for this one.
I wanted to comment on something that it puzzles me when people keep saying, they were waiting for Deborah, for the two characters to have some sort of a liaison, and like the people are saying, well, it had to have happened, but I'm wondering if that's a bit of progressivism. First of all, in 1957. The Catholic Church was very predominant in the United States. Nuns were in every town that I knew, at least, and they were all in habits. They all had, and I've known religious people, they've had the possibility of religious liaisons just because of their jobs. And I mean, they don't give that up, that this is a dedicated person, just as Mitchum was a very honorable person. I mean, the way he handled himself was so honorable as a Marine, as you would hope and expect, and probably in the 50s people were that way. And but she also, as she said, she had given her heart to Christ. So this was a person, and to me that was part of the film, was this dynamic of tension between the two of them and their backgrounds and their moral fiber. That was an important part. And the idea of expecting a sexual liaison is missing the whole point.
But Russell, you have to keep in mind, you're looking at a guy who's always been passionately in love with Deborah Kerr. So none habit or not, it would have been impossible for me not to just fall in love with this woman. But you're 100% right, Russell. Absolutely, we're bringing a 21st century perspective on. Clearly,
Yes.
Audience time would have had a different reaction. Absolutely correct.
I was about to comment that your peers or your friends in the present day who are making those comments have 70 years of time to reflect back on a more rigid and puritanical time in America. So yeah, that may be wishful thinking on their part or just present day cynicism, but no, that never would have happened in Hollywood in that day and age.
I had read that Deborah Kerr, that Huston allowed her to use her Scottish accent in this film, which was unusual. I haven't seen her in other films, so I don't know, and I wondered if that was in fact the case.
She is using her accent here, and Gary and Dan, maybe you might recall some other examples where she uses the accent. When she appears in that god-awful Casino Royale in 1967, there's a segment she appears in that Huston directed where she's playing a Scotswoman. So you hear her doing her Scottish accent in a comic way.
I thought it was an Irish accent myself, but that's just my ear, I guess.
I just remember her with a kilt doing a fling in that.
Well, that was one of the questions, because I had seen a comment somewhere where someone said that he allowed her to use her Irish accent, but in doing some research, it said that she was Scottish, that she was from
Scottish.
Scotland.
She
does have the red hair, at least in this film. I don't know if that was the color of her hair, she did. Sort of look Irish, but I don't know, what the case is. But my last question is, I suddenly realized that there were only two people really in this film. I mean, there were a few other character actors who appeared for a minute here, a few minutes there, but they had so much screen time and they had so much chemistry between the two of them that they really pulled this film together, I think, just by virtue of that. And I wondered if there are really a lot of other films that have just two people who really pull the film along. I mean, even in African Queen, I think there were some other characters who had a little bit more screen time. So this is really just the two of them. There's nobody else really.
Well, there's John Borman's Hell in the Pacific, right? That would be
Right.
An interesting companion, a double feature with this film, and from Screening
was-
Room in the Sky.
Toshiro Mifune and Lee Marvin, right?
Mhm.
But Russell, thank you for mentioning that. There aren't a lot of examples. I'm sure more will occur to us. But our next talkback will be of a lighter nature in 2 weeks. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Yes, and we got our Abbott and Costello a little confused possibly in selecting this film, but it may not have been one director's favorite, but another director stepped in, Mr. Tarantino, and has proclaimed some love for the film on the internet. We're going to see if we can dig up that clip when we talk about the film.
It's usually the highest rated of all the Abbott and Costello comedies. So, and this was made after
For good reason.
for good reason.
We can't
For
say
good
we're
reason.
nothing if not eclectic on this program.
We're not, but it'll be wonderful to see everyone. You can go to newplazacinema.org for more information on these programs. Thank you again. Thank you, Gary, for joining us. Thank you, Dan, for joining us from England.
And next time around, you'll have to tell us who's on first.
Okay, it's a deal, Joshua.